when she uses. What did you think? Do you have a? Yeah.
It was very, very clear. I actually really liked because her interviews were what I think made her statements clear. And I guess her personal experience was it when, for example, when I think about when we referred to when she made that comparison about if you're not Hilton, you can't go. If you don't look like Paris Hilton, you can't go to the hotel. You can't get anything in Dubai because, for example, basically the statement was women get treated like prostitutes or like well, I need to first of all get organized, but basically that's what I got from that, and it's just shocking to read something like that. It was just really shocking. Almost every interview is similar from every female that she interviews. It's just a shock.
It also brings me a personal memory as my uncle from my mother's side, he used to work in Dubai in KFC, and he didn't have exactly the same situation as Ravi, the guy I was talking about from Hyderabad, 3 months not paid, but he was sick and he came to Bangladesh with no money. He was in the same situation as Ravi. But he was saying that the kafil system, which sponsored, if this type of system was enacted properly, then there won't be that much of violation.
Yeah. Okay, so let me just, I want to come back to these examples and the comments, but let me first put this in a little bit of in context anthropologically, and then we'll just sort of unpack the text. Yes?
Is kafil the kafala?
Yes.
Same thing, okay.
Kafil system, kafala is a sponsor.
Oh, okay.
So, last week and this week, we're reading texts that explore, the anthropology of the Middle East, but really move away from the classic gender Islam tribes themes. Right here, we clearly have gender still. There are tribes in the sense of the organization of the state of the U.A.E., but that's not how it's, the ethnography isn't structured that way, right? So we're moving away from those classic tropes. And of course, some of the themes that are important in the Middle East are there, but they're not attacked in the same way. They're not explored in the same way. Like last week, we were talking about the formation of states, failed states or weak states, and how they manage themselves. And here we're talking about sex and gender in the Middle East, but outside the stereotyped. Well, she's trying to do two things, right? She's trying to explore the stereotypes while also tackle some of the serious issues, right? And I think she keeps saying that she gets caught in the middle of those two, right? And that's what her talk is. How do you attend to the fact that much of this, so many of these themes are overlaid with people's stereotypes, while at the same time clearly there are some serious issues. And she's sort of getting stuck in it, and I think it's good for us to read her getting stuck in it and thinking about how we get stuck in that. And in that sense, this book and the previous book sort of moving away from the more traditional approach to the Middle East. So that's just one thing I want to throw out there. And the second thing has to do a little bit with the history of the Arabian Peninsula. We've spent a lot of time in this class sort of looking at the history of Iran, the history of Egypt, history of Iraq, sort of the northern Levant. Now, the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula are pretty different in that their independence, well, not Saudi Arabia, because as we talked about earlier in the semester, Saudi Arabia formed as a state in the post-World War I, in the interwar period, right? The Sauds, remember, came from, we've got Najd and the Hejaz, and took over the Hejaz after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, right? And Saudi Arabia formed in that interwar period. The other states of the Persian Gulf, and this is another thing that you should be very aware of. There's a whole politics between whether that strip of water separating Iran and the Arabian Peninsula is called the Persian Gulf or the Arab Gulf. You can see how this happens, right? On the Iran side, people call it the Persian Gulf. On the peninsula side, they insist on the Arab Gulf. And this is it's just not resolved. In classic maps, even in Arabic, they use the Persian Gulf until relatively recently, right? But there's a whole politics of it. People often just give up and call it the Gulf because you don't want to enter into those politics. But you can see, and she's obviously Iranian, right? Her identity is Iranian. She speaks Persian. When she goes to that police station, she sort of uses her Persian. Lots of people speak Persian in Dubai. A lot of the elite in Dubai come from southern Iran and speak a dialect of Persian. There's a lot of crossing of the Gulf, of the Persian Gulf. I tend to use Persian Gulf because that's sort of classic. So let me just. So this is the U.A.E, right? And so this strip of water, either the Persian Gulf or the Arab Gulf, is obviously both a divider, but it also, historically, there's been a lot of crisscrossing, right? And people sometimes call this region, sort of the border, the area here along the water and the area here, as one kind of region. And they call them, in local language, Khaliji. That means Gulf. So it's a Khaliji identity. That said, so there's one sense that there's some kind of unified identity in this region. Because, historically, as we've said, crossing the water was easier than crossing the desert. Right? So there's not only crossing for trade, there's lots of marriage. Right? You're nodding because you're just familiar?
No, I was just thinking, it's such a marriage that makes sense.
Yeah, no one would go, very few people would go around it. And it doesn't really make sense to divide it, right? Obviously, these are two different political entities, but people crossed all the time for trade, for marriage. So it was sort of classic that you would have a big merchant family, for example, living on one side, and the patriarch of that family may have wives in the different cities, right? This obviously would be the elite who could afford supporting multiple families, right? And this was a way to establish alliance, as a way to establish trade networks. But of course, what does that do in terms of language? People are speaking within one family, Persian, Arabic, Baluch, Gujarati. There's all these languages within one family, and it wasn't necessarily a distinguishing mark in terms of nation-state formation, and this is the Arab side, and this is the Persian side. Okay. Well, we followed the history of Iran a little bit, and we focused sort of on the Tehran. There was not so much. The capital region would sometimes control the coast, but often the coastal regions here had a lot more affinity with this side of the Persian Gulf or the Arab Gulf than it did with the capital. So there was a lot of interaction between these. Still, Iran was always pretty much an independent. Right? We've talked about different periods, a lot of British influence, a lot of American influence, Russian influence, but never colonized officially. On this side, on the other hand, British officials officially, legally colonized or made these states into what they call protectorates. There's a kind of intermediate form of colonization. These were official British protectorates. The U.A.E., does anyone know when the U.A.E. gained its independence from Britain?
It's in the early 40s, was it?
1971. 1971. So very, very recently, right? So whereas most, yes.
But they were always like an economic hub. Like that's kind of what the book was talking about. They were always like an economic center even before the protectorate era. So it was like,
Well, it was a fishing village.
yeah. But it was like merchant, and so like there was a lot of merchant work going on. So there was a large economy in it for either the areas around, like
Right, so
just
it was
right
an
there.
entrepot, right? So it was Dubai, or at least parts of Dubai, you know, it's right here. So, but to get to Dubai, you still have to enter the Gulf, right? You have to go over this, there's a little thing here called the Straits of Hormuz, right? This strait. And so to go, you know, you actually have to go over these straits, around these straits. And they're like fjords. They're very high, narrow canals. And, you know, you can imagine the control of these straits from the Iran side, the Arabian Peninsula side is very geopolitical, right? Oman actually owns, this little tip is actually part of Oman and not part of the U.A.E. That's the geopolitical organization and battling, right? So this tip is actually owned by Oman and not the U.A.E. All right, so Iran on this side, the U.A.E., and then we have the other states, Kuwait, Bahrain, Baghdad, all on here. And this side, as I said, mostly gained independence from Britain very recently. Unlike the rest of the Middle East, right, where independence was either, you know, formed after the Ottoman Empire, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, or gained independence in the 50s, 60s, you know, some, but mostly 40s, 50s, 60s. U.A.E. gained independence in 1971. Okay. So, cultural dynamics, sort of interesting tensions with Iran, a lot of influence, but also increasingly after the 70s and 80s, as the U.A.E. gets independence, the U.A.E. and these other states on this side insist increasingly on being Arab states. Right? So on the one hand, as I said, many of the elite, not all the elite in Dubai, by any means, or the U.A.E. or Qatar or Bahrain or whatever, but there's quite a number of the elite on this side are at home Persian speaking of some dialect, or Gujarati speaking. Right? So they're not Arab in the terms of primarily Arabic speakers at home. Yeah.
Gujarati as Muslims or Hindu Gujaratis?
What?
Hindu Gujaratis or Muslim Gujaratis?
Both.
Oh, okay.
Both. Both. And that becomes a very interesting dynamic too, right? Because who are they going to marry? Who are they going to be? What part of the community are they going to be? And the question has been, you know, as these states increasingly define themselves as opposed to Iran, right, as non-Persian speaking, non-Iran. Iran is Shia, remember? These states are Sunni. As the nation states form, and that becomes a model of political system, those systems increasingly create a sense of who their citizens are. We talked about in Yemen how that happens even without a strong state. But here we have states that are very strong. And so they insist on being Arab states. And that, of course, feeds into the sense that they're non-Iranian, non-Persian, not Indian, non-Pakistani, right? So that's part of the main dynamics that we're at play here. In terms of the elite. The other part of the elite, political structure that's important to remember. So that's one point. The second point that I wanted to raise that's very important to remember is that the political systems, it's been argued, come as a sort of a outcrop, and we've mentioned this before, of relations with Britain. In the sense that the leading families in these states, on the one hand, are sort of seen as tribal heads, right? However, they were often families that had been part of this merchant network originally, but were the families that the British dealt with. So as British colonial, administrators established along the Gulf, and we know, what was the reason for establishing administration in the Gulf? It wasn't oil, right? There wasn't oil in the 19th century when the British started to arrive here. The reason for being here was to ensure passage to India, right? So, as the British set up sort of administrative posts along the Gulf, right, to make sure passage to India was smooth, and the French wouldn't enter, right? That was the geopolitical battle in the 19th century, was to make sure that the British controlled the territory and the French did not. Right? So as they did this, there were families with whom they engaged politically. Right? And many of these families, it's the same families from the late 19th century to today, are the same families who are leaders of these states. Right? There have been arguments that, prior to British colonial protectorate administration, there was a lot more fluidity in who would have been the rulers of these states. But as the British established themselves and said, okay, you are the ruler that we're going to engage with. We talked about this before. I come back next year. I want to be top country, or I'm going to establish myself. And these states sort of cemented around these particular families. Okay, so that's the first thing. Persian-Arab sort of tensions underlying political formations. Second thing is the states being formed in terms of these ruling families that have been ruling families for a long time, that are very, very important. And then finally is the relative newness of the establishment of the independence of these states. Right? They're very new. And they each have, very different perspectives or different things that they highlight. So, not all of the states are like the U.A.E. The U.A.E. is a federation, like the U.S., right? It's sort of structured like a federation like the U.S. Each city-state, so there's 7 of them. Abu Dhabi is the capital. It is the place where there is the most oil. Dubai is another city-state. It does not have as much oil. It is the commercial hub. But it is a federation, and there are, they have their own independent governments, just like our states have their own independent governments. And each federal state belongs to the federation differently, right? The way it works in the U.A.E. is that the head ruler of each federation has a set position in the federal government. So the ruler of Abu Dhabi is the president of the entire federation. The ruler of Dubai is the prime minister. And then there you have the more minor states as part of this 7-state federation. But the big powerhouses are Abu Dhabi with oil and Dubai with the commercial sector. The history of Dubai being an entrepot is a very interesting one because it has a lot of that sense that it was an entrepot, but it's unclear how big of an entrepot it really was. I mean, it was very much a fishing village. There was trade across the Gulf, but it was pretty small. Yeah, I mean, first time I went to Dubai was 1972. It was not a big entrepot even then, and that was after the start. When Dubai really expanded was when they made a huge investment to create a port, a deep water port. So basically there was a very concerted effort to make it a hub. And they did that by dredging a port so that big container ships, because container ships to get there actually have to make a detour, right? It's not as though it's well on the way. If you come down from Europe through the Mediterranean, you go through the Suez Canal, you come down the Red Sea, and you're going to East Asia, you actually, and you're going to make a stop, you actually have to make a little bit of a detour, does everyone follow, to go into Dubai and then back out. But Dubai made a concerted effort with a big deep water port and therefore attract those container ships into Dubai and then back out to East Asia. Is everyone following? So today, Oman is competing with that they built a deep water port in southern Oman, there's Yemen here, on the border with Yemen. Has anyone seen the film Captain Phillips? Anyone see that film? About Somali pirates? Did you ever see it? You saw it, right? You know, the very beginning of that scene where he's at a huge container shipping place, that's in Salalah in southern Oman.
Oh, that's really funny. Oh.
And that's what I mean, I don't know if that's real. That was probably, Elizabeth or, New Jersey or somewhere in Rhode Island. But it was supposed to be southern Oman, which is a competitor now of Dubai. But that's very easy. But what made Dubai Dubai was partly this history of but it didn't just happen organically. What happened was Dubai made a concerted effort to make it a deep water port to attract the containers. Yes.
Because I thought it was like that's where the book sort of presented it as that was the hub for the British protectorate trade throughout the Gulf. Like, so that's where all of their trade kind of funneled through within the Gulf, but not beyond that. And so everything would kind of come through them and then back out. And that kind of gave them a lot of their cash when it came to later on.
Yes, that is true. But what propelled Dubai into the Dubai that we know is only partially that history. Okay. It's possible that the Maktoum family, Sheikh Mo and his father, established Dubai out of that history and said this is a great place for the deep water port. British can support the building of the deep water port, et cetera, et cetera. But what really propelled it was this. There's also, of course, as mentioned, a history of what's called piracy, in quotes, and smuggling. So this coast, the British often called this the pirate coast. There's a problem of quote unquote piracy. And part of that, you know, question is what's piracy mean? How do we define piracy? The British felt like things were their properties, their ships were getting attacked, ships were getting stolen. People there say, well, they were coming here and not paying taxes that they should have been paying. This is an attempt to get us taxes. So there's a whole debate about a history of piracy on this coast. Everyone following? The ruler of the ruler of one of the other emirates called Sharjah. Sharjah is one of the other emirates. So Abu Dhabi, Sharjah, another emirate. The ruler of this emirate is a historian, received his PhD in history, and he wrote a book arguing against this notion of a pirate coast. British came in, they didn't pay their taxes. This is our attempt to get what belongs to us. So there's a tension between them. Okay, so putting all of this sort of Dubai Emirates into context, new states, rulers that come out of a British history, tension with Iran, but also the establishment of the U.A.E. as a modern state, very, very recent. So that gets us to a little bit sort of prehistory of trafficking. Now, here, as you said, and as you have mentioned, he's struggling with trying to balance representations of trafficking, sex work, with recounting the problems with the actual, the issues of migrant labor, right? Because, as you said, the percentages of local Dubaians with foreigners is really dramatic. So what are they? Remember?
It's like 2%, 3% actual Emiratis.
How many?
Like 2 or 3% actual Emiratis that are within versus like, what is it? Like 91% is all
Expat or
foreign labor, and then very, very few are actually in the labor force. Maybe it was like 2 or 3% in the labor force, and then like maybe 9 or 8%.
But what about actual citizens or like in the population? How much of the population is local population? Whenever local, I mean, post-7, like people whose families have been there pre-1971, right? I mean, how do you decide what a local is when everyone's moving around historically? People are speaking of a billion different languages, but at a certain point, someone gets defined as a local, and citizenship has to be defined some way. So, given that, what percentage, do you remember? Approximately.
50? No.
It's like less than 10%, right?
No, it's about 20%. So 20% of the population is local. And that means 80% of the population walking down the street, the vast majority of people on the street, out in the offices, around, are not Emirati, right? They're from somewhere else.
But they're not citizens.
Hmm?
They're not citizens.
Who?
The 80%? The other
Oh
80%?
yeah, no, they're not citizens, right? So they're all these people, 80% of the population, are there for what? Yeah.
Meaning they're there to work.
They're there for work, right? So when we were going to add something.
I was gonna say that.
Yeah, right. So if you imagine 80% of your population is there for work, that means they're transient, right? They're not allowed to get citizenship, even if you want to get citizenship. Many people don't even want to get citizenship. Some people do. And the question is, how do you manage a state when 80% of your population is transient, only there for work, which means there for money, right? It's not just, on the one hand, it's for work, but it's about capital. It's about being there to make money in some form. And people are making money in many different ways, or trying to make money in many different ways. Right? And so people, all over the world, trying to go to this place where they imagine they can make money. The trick, right? The lure, which often doesn't work, which is bad. All right. So let's go through the way she's framing the problem of 80% of the population being there, being in this place for money, some of whom are going voluntarily. And the question is, what does that mean? Some of whom are not, some of whom are there but getting sucked into these dynamics about which they have no control, some of whom do have some control. And so what she's trying to parse out is, how do you distinguish between the different kinds of movement and labor in this place? So how do we do that? And what does she say some of the pitfalls are? So let's sort of outline some of this. In the pink Kabbalah, that's really important. Let's start by outlining some of the different kinds of migrants or terms that one could use, and what are the implications of them.
It was racially divided pretty heavily, where like European Americans would be expats and they would have higher wage earning jobs, whereas people from like Ethiopia, Nigeria, or like brown or black countries, as they were termed, would be like lower middle class workers or even like general labor jobs. So it was very racially divided based on your skin color or origin, place of origin.
Place of origin, right?
That would determine your wage earning.
More than, but yeah. So the terms, she says, themselves have suggested stereotypes associated with it. So that people coming from Europe or the United States or Australia, right, are often called expats. Whereas people coming from South Asia primarily, right? So from the Indian Peninsula, so from Bangladesh, from India, Pakistan, are often called migrant laborers. So just in the terms themselves, there are presumptions. So why wouldn't you call, in other words, the question is, why wouldn't you call someone from South Asia an expat? Okay. But this is also gendered in the sense that migrant laborers, the term migrant laborer, is presumed to be male. Okay. So that would be applied, the term migrant laborer would be stereotyped as someone from South Asia, unskilled labor, usually in construction, right? Because that's what is the economy, right? If Abu Dhabi, the economy is oil, what is the economy of Dubai? And it's not oil. There isn't that much oil, but it's a huge economy.
Tourism.
Tourism is part of it, But what is, what does tourism do? Like, why? Okay, so yes, tourism is part of the economy, but it's not huge.
Tourism like fills the downtime between all the people that are going there to actually do the trading and commerce attached to that oil.
Right.
So they'd be negotiating the deals or making the office work end of the oil jobs.
So there's commerce, so actual things being traded or going from place to place, so in the ports, out of the ports. But there's also, what else is, rent or construction. So basically, right, you have, and this is related to it. So the question is, what is the economy of Dubai? Right, it's not oil, it's tourism, it's commerce, like people actually coming and going and trading, but it's also the building and the renting itself. Right, so big, Dubai families, yes.
So they also
How does that work?
Dubai is seen as a place where people come to reinvent themselves. And get reinvention.
Well, that is more like a personal thing. Like,
Or a sense of
people are,
migration. I don't know if that is a good thing.
so what does that mean? So if it's a place where people go and reinvent themselves, what does that mean?
Supposedly, like, what technically where people come to find themselves, but then they say that it's not surprising that it would become a sense of migration. So then it takes another point to about the migration of the work of the trafficking of why people come to Dubai, why of the reason of my trafficking. Like,
Well, I mean, I think this is a good question.
I just took it as reinvent yourself space about starting new, like a new life, a new job.
It's like the fantasy, the global fantasy of getting out of whatever economic situation you're in. Right? Why people come to the U.S. It's the attempt to, if you're in an economic situation where there is very little movement. So for example, think about that article we read about boredom in rural Egypt. Right? And where did people imagine going? Yeah, you imagine going to Europe, you might imagine going to the US, but the other place is the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, the Arab Gulf, and a place like Dubai. And why that is to try to recreate your life through economic means if possible. And so people are attracted to going there. Right? And of course, it often doesn't pan out, it's often very difficult, it's often abusive, but that would be coming here, would be the same, as we all know, as going to Europe. It's not easy. But people hear stories of success, and then it fuels movement. Right? Someone made it, and that story will spur on other people to go. And I think we're all familiar. That's why probably most of our families try to come here. Right? Same thing. Right? And Dubai is one. So that's what I think. So, but yes, go on with your question. Yeah.
I mean, if they come to reinvent themselves, and it's not. I mean, it's the fact that it's not surprising or that has become a sense of migration. But then all these interviews about, like, I don't want to call it the Dubai dream or something like that, but these interviews don't seem to show that. And it's like just the opposite of that. So is that really what it is? Can we really say that?
What do you mean? Can we say what? That it is a place where you can reinvent yourself?
Yeah. Is it?
Well, that's the story of this book, right? Is that people are attracted, just like people are attracted to coming to the U.S. And if you interview, well, but if you interview a lot of people,
Some will say, some will not.
Yeah, some will say it worked, but I suspect the vast majority of people would say it's pretty horrible.
Like that one interview
You know?
she did with that girl Minia, I think it was, who like
Yeah.
where she came from. She was middle class, lower class, poor, came here to help her family. And when she did her first interview, she was living in a high rise in one of the nicest port cities ever. Like
Yeah.
that's reinventing yourself. That's
One out of
80 interviews that she did. You know.
Right. And so that one story will fuel desire on everybody else's part to try to take a risk. It's worth that risk. Possibly. Right? People feel on before they go. So what the question is what, pushes people to take that risk? It's that fantasy. That I will one day own or rent a fancy apartment in Dubai.
$1 in a dream.
What?
$1 in a dream.
$1 in a dream, right? And she's trying to say, well, the underside of that fantasy is all of this, right? And that's, one could say the same thing about the U.S. in some ways. I mean, obviously, probably not as stark because our percentages are different. But if you go to places in Texas, places in California, places in Arizona, places in North Carolina, it's not all that different. I mean, it is in some ways, but obviously not in other ways.
But it all has its pros and cons.
Uh-huh.
It
Right.
just works for some people and it doesn't work for others.
Right, but the question is that she's asking are what are the structural conditions that make it work or don't make it work? And what are the stereotypes we have in understanding what works and what doesn't work? Like what does it mean to work? Like how does it work? How does it not work? So if we start with the structural conditions and then also think about the lenses, the discourses that we have to think about what works and what doesn't, then it's helpful, right? If you look at it at two sides. Yes.
I was thinking about it a lot in terms of like New York in the 80s,
Yeah.
where there was a huge economic boom on Wall Street and commerce was massive. And everybody in Idaho saw this as like, I can go there and get rich quick. And then in the early 90s, the streets were littered with all sorts of people that tried and failed. And that was it. And there was no homeless. I mean, there was homeless outreach, but it was nowhere near
What it is now.
right. And the reason it is what it is now is because of 20 years ago, because of the huge fallout from that. And so, there would be the one guy that's the Wolf of Wall Street and makes it big and is having parties on his yacht, and everybody sees that and says, I can do that too, comes here and lives in the Amtrak tunnels.
Yeah. And I think that's the story she's telling, but in Dubai with other structural conditions that make it possible or impossible, right? And so the question is, what are the structural conditions that make it possible or impossible? Now, one of the structural conditions that makes it very hard is our laws of citizenship, right? Which is similar and different here. Like that's why we have these huge fights about citizenship. How can people get citizenship? You shouldn't get citizenship. Exactly, it's very, it's a different angle on it, but it's about having access, legal access and legal recourse out there. But also, in Dubai, one of the structural conditions of both the economy that makes the Dubaian economy successful for Dubaians, right? Because Dubaians have to agree to have their rulers have all these 80% foreigners there who offend them and say horrible things and wear bikinis on the beach and do, have nightclubs and puke in the streets and, it's a, has anyone been to Dubai? I mean, it's, yeah.
Well, I haven't been to it, but after reading this book, they said something about a law that this is a little off topic, but I found this interesting. It's gonna make me go look up the laws for non-citizens in Dubai because someday I will go. It's one of my dreams for that.
See, okay. But if you try to reinvent yourself, let us know.
One of my friends who went to Dubai told me that if you are a non-citizen, you are not allowed to have any alcoholic drinks. Only citizens can have alcoholic drinks. And I also read in the book they said that citizens like with HIV positive, who are HIV positive, will get all the healthcare benefits. And then what I found interesting was like if they find out that you're a non-citizen who is with HIV positive, you will get deported. So I just found that interesting, and I want to find out the rest of the.
Well, the alcohol laws in Japan is actually not true.
It's not true.
It's not true. So alcohol, just to throw out, alcohol laws in Dubai is that alcohol can be sold and served in restaurants that are in hotels. You can't just have a bar with a license. You have to be physically, has to be in a hotel. And the idea is that it'll be controlled. It's for tourists. It's not supposedly for the citizens, right? Who are supposedly not coming. Okay. So, but that's not 100% true. There are a couple nightclubs that are freestanding. They've got licenses because whatever, right? Right? So, but for the most part, bars and restaurants that serve alcohol are in hotels. Now they control who enters those bars and restaurants very strictly, in the sense that you cannot, a Dubaian wearing traditional Dubaian clothes is actually banned from entering a restaurant or bar. You can go to a restaurant, but you can't go into just a nightclub bar if you're wearing. So you're a citizen wearing traditional clothes cannot enter, right? Because technically you're not supposed to be doing it. Again, technically it's supposed to be for the tourists and for the foreigners who are allowed to be. But of course it also means that there's a lot of control, social control over who enters bars. Or bouncers basically control who looks appropriate, and that's extended beyond the control of just locals entering bars. So it's what the bar thinks that their clientele should be. It's just like trying to get into a nightclub with a red whatever. They'll control who enters that. So it's actually the reverse. It's not that. It's the reverse. So citizens are not supposed to be drinking. That said, like I said, you can have, there are very elite bars where it's fudged, but that's the basic. Also, if you live in Dubai and you are working in a sort of management condition, or if you're working in Dubai, you can apply for a license to buy alcohol at regulated alcohol shops, buy wine, liquor, right? So there are, like in New Hampshire, they're like liquor shops, or in Virginia, there are liquor shops that are regulated by the state. But in Dubai, just not anyone can walk in there, you have to have a license. And you apply for a license from the state, and the state looks at who you are, how much money you make. In other words, you're an expat, right? You follow, your right ethnic background, your right religious background. So if you apply and say, I'm Muslim and I want to get alcohol, they're going to say no, because you're not legally supposed to have alcohol. Is everyone following? So there's a lot of yes.
But I was curious then about, like, as an Emirati opening something like that. So, like, I'm Muslim and I'm an Emirati. Can I apply now through the state to buy liquor to sell to other tourists? Is that legally allowed? Like, so they can have their own businesses within there?
Yes.
And then not only for...
Right. So an Emirati can open a restaurant, right, and sell alcohol, right? Usually what happens, and this gets the kafala system, which is very expensive, and how the Dubaian economy is very structured. It's like sponsorship. So that no business and no foreigner can be in Dubai, technically, although it's changed very recently and it's different now, unless you are sponsored by a local. Which means to be sponsored by a local, you have a financial agreement. Right? So if you're a Dubaian, you just sit there and you collect rent. Your property that you own is your citizenship. Is everyone following? So me as a Dubaian citizen, my passport gives me access to rent. That's how it works. I don't have to do anything productive. I just am, with this passport, able to give you sponsorship, which means that you have to give me some money, and then you can come to Dubai and do your business, and you will make your profit, and I get a cut. And that citizenship, that my passport affords me that right. Yes.
So that's really exploitation. Because they hold it against the person.
They
If
can.
you do this.
They can, right? They can. Doesn't necessarily mean exploitation. It can. But that's the structural condition that creates the condition for that exploitation, is the sponsorship system.
I'm just wondering how, is there like a market kind of for the sponsorship or?
That's a great question.
is-
I mean, so certain, in some ways, yes, there's a market, right? But it's pretty expensive, right? It's not, ask me why you're asking this, and then I'll respond.
Oh, I'm just wondering how
How it's
you
working
would,
on.
yeah, and how you would get a sponsor. You have to know someone or there's kind of like, I imagine you don't go to a website and like look up sponsors or, or maybe you do, I don't know.
Well, basically, it's usually, the way it works is that now that basically Dubaians enter different business venues. And as business people, they look for labor on the global market. And when they do that, they arrange the sponsorship through that business venture. It's like people who, people apply for a visa to the U.S. If you're applying for a student visa, your sponsor is the university. Right? So we sort of have, there's someone who is accounting for you. Right? So the university system, the college, becomes your sponsor if you're applying for a student visa. If you are applying for a job in the U.S., the job has to send a letter to the consulate to say, we are paying you, we are providing you health insurance, we have hired you. They become your kind of a sponsor, sort of. So I have a research, a doctoral student who's going to come from Italy next year. I'm going to she's going to take a letter, official letter from Queens College to the consulate and say, Queens College I'm not paying her, vouching for it. So it's different, but it's like a vouching system, but that is very much tied into capital, into money, and it provides rent, basically, for Dubaians, and that's where a lot of the money comes from. So, is there a market? In a way, there is.
I was just wondering, so it's kind of hierarchical where it would be like, say, Faisal is my sponsor, but I'd never actually interact with him. It's through a network of company, and so I'm like a subcontractor through his citizenship.
It depends.
Yeah.
It depends. So, for example, if you work in a small trading firm, oil trading firm, let's say, in your upper management, your boss is good friends with the sponsor, probably, right? And you probably go out to dinner with your sponsor, you know your sponsor. So yes, you would know your sponsor. If you are a construction worker on a 40-story high-rise, and you've been hired from a village, you are not going to be your sponsor. You have no idea who your sponsor is. You probably know the name.
They out-contracted their sponsorship to this group that's now doing the headhunting.
Exactly. And then so in Bangladesh, in India, in Pakistan, there will be intermediaries all the way down to the village level, probably, finding labor to send back. And that's why she's talking about, and that's why she's interested in these words called trafficking because the question about, and we'll get to that, trafficking presumes, if it's legal, presumes certain things and requires certain things of people, right? Which presumes that you, basically the idea is that you've been stolen. But that's not how it works. That's not actually, people aren't stolen off the streets in a village. It's these intermediaries who are often family members. Or people voluntarily, I mean, that's the question, is like how is intention structured? Like how do we decide to take that risk? Yeah.
Yeah, it's like voluntary. It's like that one story of that one girl who that two guys pulled up in the car and offered, I think it was $50 for their phone numbers. They called the next day and offered her $400. So it was her choice. So it's like you see where it's not whether it was forced or not.
Yeah.
So you see the difference of the category of the forced labor or the volunteer.
Right. But the question is, how do you make that distinction at the level of someone who is making a decision? I mean, without complete knowledge of what's going on.
Right, like
So
that.
at what point is that forced? Right? Sorry, go on.
That wouldn't have been an idea that she would have entertained if she was in a better situation in a legal occupation.
Right.
If her, economic situation was more stable and, accountable and reliable, that wouldn't have been a viable option. I mean, it might have been just a good supplementary thing depending on whatever her ideas are, but it probably would have been less entertained if her station was more stable.
Right. Or if you're in a situation where you hear that things are better somewhere, and someone comes along and says, I will arrange for you passage to this place and job for 3 years, and then you'll make all this money. That's not, and you say, okay, that's not forced, but at the same time, you agree to do this, and yet you don't make that much money, you lose your passport, you don't have control over your own passport, you have all these other things that make it very, very difficult. It's not forced, but it's also not fully, I guess the question is, how does consciousness and intention play out in these definitions of trafficking?
So how would that not be forced? Because if they take your passport and you don't have access to that, and if they lock you up in a house like they did, I think it was with Mia, and they abused her, and she tried to get away to the police station. The police, when they listened to her story, they called back to the employer, and she was abused once again. And then I think she jumped out of the third-story house, injured herself, and it's like she basically had no money. She couldn't really do anything. So I see the point of whether it was like forced or not, but it's like the point that I'm trying to make is I know where somebody tells you, oh, you can make this much money for 3 years, this and this, but then when they take your passport and you don't get that much money and you're stuck at this, how is that not forced?
Yeah, no, it is, right? So it is. So I guess what we're trying to say is that these definitions, they're not so easy. So the decision to go may not be forced, but then when you're in that situation, then it's coercive and you have no rights. And right? So at what point does it become coercive, right? At what point, so it's not, I think that what she's trying to get at is that these categories of trafficking, these categories of forced labor are not necessarily as clear-cut as the definitions present themselves to be. Because at any stage, things can shift from, and the original decision to go is often It's not a kidnapping, right? And yet it's structured as, the legal structure is structured as a kidnapping. Yes.
And the definitions in the legal structure itself serve to push that divide further.
Exactly.
So like they only define trafficking in terms of sex labor and female victims, whereas the case of the construction workers who were stuck working 3 months on injuries
Yeah.
is the exact same thing.
Exactly. And because the law, so it does a few things. It sort of ignores a lot of men who are stuck in very similar situations. It victimizes women who, some of whom do, I mean, it's not necessarily that people who do sex work don't want to do sex work, that the presumption is that they're all victims, right? And on the one hand, it presumes that men are not part of this, like coerced labor. On the other hand, it presumes that all women are, so it does that gendered thing. But it also, because the legal structure is made in this way, it enables the labor market to continue because it's so narrowly defined in terms of basically kidnapping, right? And it completely ignores that murky gray area of not complete knowledge, of some kind of maybe not coercion but pressure. And, what happens? A teenager, a 19-year-old, the family says, we want money, we want money, we want money, and pushes you. Now it's coercive from your family. It's not coercive from someone jumping out of a truck and kidnapping you. So where are the legal protections against your own family?
And then it's manipulation on the hands of the employer who
Exactly.
knows that.
Right.
Takes advantage.
Exactly. And the state or the international sort of legal bodies that focuses on trafficking in such a narrow sense enable this entire productive labor market, not productive in a positive sense, but the construction workers who get paid very little enable that to happen because they're focusing on this very narrow, gendered, trafficked world. Right? Is everyone? Right. And then she also points out that the laws require that the person who is trafficked do what? What does the person have to do?
Testify against their trafficker
Exactly.
in that situation.
Right? So if you think about the legal structure to say, okay, so the presumption is that I've been kidnapped, which most likely I have not. There are all these other social pressures and economic pressures and political pressures and coercions and manipulations and all these things. So on that one level, like, okay, so legally, I haven't really even been kidnapped. But then on top of that, or I'm a man, right? Which then makes it very difficult. But then on top of that, to pursue a legal case, I personally have to jump out of a window, go to a police station, and testify in a bureaucratic legal structure that makes it incredibly difficult to do against my sponsors or against this industry that I'm completely beholden to. So these are the structural conditions that she's trying to have us think about. Okay, so if that's the problem, how are we going to tackle this? What can we do? But that's the whole the detail of how we can manage it. All right. So this is what she's talking about in terms of the term words. The beginning, agency, and that's why these terms are important for her analysis. So on this is the very beginning, on page 14. In presenting the stories, this is a section, a note on agency and discourse. In presenting the stories and lived experiences of the migrant workers that form the basis of this study. Throughout the book, I draw on a series of concepts, debates, and policy recommendations. A closer look at the labels and mislabeling arises from these concepts, as well as the conceptual umbrella itself follows. Closer look. I use the concept of agency throughout the text to refer to an individual's capacity, desire, and potential to make choices and decisions about his or her own life, trajectories, and future. Agency is the ability to act as an individual and to determine one's own fate. Right? And that, and that's the part that is so difficult to ascertain. To what extent, how can, when you have responsibility, obligations, loyalties to an extended family, not only to yourself, how do you determine an individual's agency? Because it's not, how can you decide what is really one's choice? Really one's decision in an individual? I think it's nearly impossible. Okay? It is often thought to be limited by the concept of structure, the term used to refer to institutions or conditions that might support or restrict agency. So she's talking about how these notions are usually used. So individual choice, the ability to act, the ability to act on decisions, to determine one's own fate at the individual level. So usually that idea is contained or constrained by something called structure. And that's the organization, the institutions that prevent you or push you into acting in a certain way. The term used to refer to institutions or conditions that might support or restrict agency. Structures can include systems such as education, employment, sector, and state regulations, or socially constructed categories such as class, race, gender, ethnicity, nationality, and group identity. Right? So it's not simply the institutions, the legal structures that make you who you are, or those forces, but it's also social class ideas, notions of race, ethnicity, nationality. Those are beyond the individual, right? And they also constrain, restrict, make you, and it's, the agency and structure are the two forms that are often contrasted with each other. When you think about how agency happens within the structure or against the structure. Is everyone following that? Okay. Individuals often find and exercise agency even within the structures that seek to limit them. Throughout the book, I use migrants' stories and show how migrants find pockets of agency in situations of oppression and repression. I draw on the concept of agency in order to move beyond the traditional view of migrant workers as victims solely of their circumstances, to point to the deliberate choices they make as enterprising and courageous persons seeking to make a better life for themselves and their families, to move into one industry or another, and to leave their home country in search of work in the U.A.E. And I'm just going to continue reading because I think it sort of encapsulates what she's trying to get to. The concept of agency is also particularly useful in talking about and understanding the nature of sex work. I opt to use the term sex work to recognize the agency of persons involved in this industry, specifically those who view sex work as a job rather than a defining identity. In defining sex work, it is useful to look at the UN definition embedded in the language of the report. Use of the term sex work, I'm just going to jump, thus attempts to situate the industry within a framework of labor so that those involved in it can access the rights and protections afforded to other laborers. Right? Because otherwise, if you don't presume that sex workers are workers with agency, right, who make deliberate decisions and are not simply victims, I mean, that obviously happens too, right? But once you get out of that perspective, then they can access rights that other laborers can also access. Yes?
But that cut two ways in the example with the cop, where he was, I mean, those women and the higher end escorts all expressed their own agency and were seen as doing so, but they were not afforded the rights because they were thought to have dug their own graves, so to say, or like they made a choice and actively pursued it, and this is their end, so they don't deserve the rights and, you know, right, they don't deserve protection.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so there becomes in a very interesting way, there becomes a lot of power in claiming victimhood. Right? So if you can, and so this is a lot of debates about the problem with human rights discourse is that it creates a space where being a victim, self-defining as a victim, affords you rights and access. And therefore, it's like the victimization of people. It's self-deliberate, deliberate is also a very difficult word. Like, to what extent is it deliberate, right? Start to think of you're a victim, etc. But yes, so therefore, it's exactly right. So that's one critique, is that on the one hand, you want to give people or recognize people's own agency, not to presume that they're always repressed, always oppressed, and powerless. Right? At the same time, it then, by doing that, it sort of doesn't afford them the powers of the access as victims, but then, so this is constantly.
It goes too far to the other end where all of a sudden, like, all right, you made a decision and now you have to live with the consequences of it, and no matter what that may be, that's how it plays. I mean, the same thing with the construction worker or the prostitute in the high-end building. They would be also seen as expressing their own agency, but they'd have to deal with toughing it out, is one of the examples that the guy used. Like, I know what I was going into, so now I have to just ride this wave.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the other side of it. So on the one hand, you give people that power, that agency, right? That self-agency, and so power within. And on the other hand, then they become supposed responsible individuals outside of the structure and the forces that right? Yeah.
I was also curious about the police too, because they were all contracted elsewhere police, so they were brought in from another location. So they could technically also be seen as a sort of trafficked element in that they're forced to do a job in an area that they're not necessarily familiar with language-wise, but they all usually had a base of Persian, but there would be a whole lot of different other dialects going on in the station.
Yeah.
So how come they didn't see any sort of identification with themselves in those other facets?
Well, that's a good question. What do you think? I mean, in many ways, I mean, they're also, so a lot of the police in Dubai are Baluch, or, they speak Baluchi, they speak Baluch, they're Baluchi, or they understand some Persian, they can speak some Persian, so this gets into the Khaliji world, and there was always a history in the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula of hiring Baluch in the military movements. They were sort of seen as the ethnic mercenaries of the Indian Ocean, whether it was in Zanzibar or up into the Arabian Peninsula.
Like the Basques.
What?
Like the Basques.
Like the Basques, exactly. So the Indian Ocean sort of police, military, ethnic base is often Baluch. And so I think part of the answer is that there's a history of themselves seeing themselves in this role.
Okay.
And so they're not the transient, so yes, they're not Emirati in the same way, but they also have a proud tradition of serving historically in this role. And yes, they are subject to a precarious legal system that can on occasion say, okay, we've had enough balut, so we want to bring in, X, Y, and Z population. But they don't see themselves as transient.
And they also see themselves as part of the larger community.
They see themselves as part of the history of police and military work in the Indian Ocean. So they have that history, even if they're not. So yeah, they don't identify equally with the other transient laborers, even though in some ways, yeah. So for example, the U.A.E. government may even hire Omanis as their police, but often there'll be Omani Baluch who become the police. And then every once in a while they'll say, okay, U.A.E. will say, okay, we don't want any more Omanis, but what they're really saying is we don't want an Omani Baluch. So yes, they're transient, but they have this long and increased worse. But yes, you would imagine that they would at least feel some kind of camaraderie with the other laborers. Okay. But we will finish reading it, and we will talk about more of the individual interviews and conversations.